Hi, Professor Olson coming at you almost live. Hope you're having a great time enjoying the beautiful weather. And I thought we would talk about the Hellenistic world today, chapter 4. I hope you had a chance to see my post. If not, just a quick background. Hellenism, which is this fusion of Greek and Persian culture, which is going to come out of Alexander the Great's conquests, lends itself to individualism, particularism, people who want to make themselves seem larger than life. I think they would have been right at home with social media had they had the platform. And we will explore how all this happens in chapter 4. So, shall we get started? All right. So, I do want to address the one question briefly. Many people consider Alexander great. One of the things I really want to impress on you, and I mentioned this in my discussion post as well as, today as we go through this video, Alexander's military conquests were staggering and were a worthy achievement at the time when viewed through the lens of the mindset of the people at the time. And they are still, from a military standpoint, pretty amazing. But his real gift, if you will, to the ancient world was leaving behind a cultural shift, leaving behind a completely new way of viewing the world and taking in culture and exploring the world around the people wherever they happen to be. His empire would not survive him. His two sons were far too young to take over, and it's believed they were slain in order to make way for new empires. But his cultural achievements are very, very impactful. And in that sense, he is great because he left behind this cultural system. Just a little note that might make you feel more engaged if you're more of a modern person. Alexander the Great's accomplishments inspired future generals, Roman, European, and even American. And it was believed that he who had the body of Alexander or any great general in the ancient world controlled their power, that they could use that as a form of legitimacy. And we'll talk about that momentarily when we get to Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic kingdom. But when we look at it, Napoleon actually was a great conqueror as well, in much the same vein as Alexander, if we're looking at a military achievement perspective. And much as we don't like Hitler, he actually went to Napoleon's tomb almost in a way like he was trying to gain legitimacy, just as we'll see Ptolemy and the argument over the body of Alexander in this chapter. So there was still that superstition, if you will, that was being passed down even in the 20th century. So let's dive in, shall we? Let's talk about the ancient world. All right. The Macedonians actually were Greek. Remember, we talked about Greek identity being cemented by things like the Olympic Games, the concept of arete or excellence, about the dramas and the comedies that would, come to form part of their culture and also unite them in the Delphi, the Oracle at Delphi. But ironically, the Macedonians, while seen as Hellenes in Greek, were not entirely Greek in a way. First off, they're not on the Hellespont. Second off, they probably somehow became Greek through exposure to the other Greek groups, but they didn't follow all of the Greek rules. They had more than one wife. They also tended to listen to their women more than the other Greek cultures at the time did. But they did participate in the Greek games, the Olympic Games, and they were touched by that society, so they did have the concept of arete and a number of the other cultural markers. Remember, no non-Greeks were able to participate in the Olympic Games. However, the Macedonians were probably not Greek right out of the gate, if you will, to use a racing analogy. All right. And when we look at Alexander's achievements, we must consider his father, because his father's preparations helped to springboard Alexander forward. All right. So Philip argued, because remember, all the Greek city-states were divided by distance and by philosophical differences, Athens, Sparta. All right. And so he wanted to create a unified Greece and do that through this new Corinthian League that had sprung up after the Delian League had failed. All right. And some people welcomed Philip as a strong leader. They felt he had their best interests at heart. And others said, no, he doesn't. And he's going to make us all conform and be secondary to him and to the Macedonians. So there was a lot of argument about this. But the Peloponnesian War had weakened a lot of the Greek city-states. Alexander had a massive fortune. Gold had been found in his mines, and he had also used booty from other conquests, and also sold a lot of those prisoners of war into slavery. So Alexander's roots through Philip, he actually has the resources which we will see are necessary to propel him forward. All right, Philip is assassinated. It said it was by a male lover that had lured him to a grove. When we speak of homosexuality in the Greek world, it was seen as a way for men to mentor younger men. It was seen as a way to help them with political power and understanding how politics worked. It was for advancement. And remember, too, that the Greeks, I believe I covered this last session, but just in case, the Greeks saw women more or less as baby makers. They were not fully human. They were human, but they were not fully human in the same way that a man was. Remember, this is a lot of their reasoning, their logic. So it was believed that only two men could truly engage in a love affair because they were considered equals. So, not having said that, a lot of Greek men did love their wives. Not every male in the Greek world engaged in homosexuality, but it was part of their culture. All right, just to put that in perspective. All right, so Philip is assassinated. It might have been a concentrated assassination. It might have simply been a moment of, a crime of passion, if you will. We don't entirely know the details. But what we do know is this. Philip's son, Alexander, had already been with his father, with his father's generals. He was 16. He had already engaged in some military actions. So when Philip is assassinated, Alexander has support of his father's army. He has the tools and the resources necessary. So he's able to suppress dissenters. He's able to now take control of Macedon. He's able to move forward. And of course, it's a way to increase his gold, to replenish his treasuries even further by invading Persia. Now, if you remember, Persia had already tried to invade Greece. They had taken over smaller city-states like Lydia, for example, which gave us coinage. They were the ones to really start to implement a coinage system. So, and then, of course, everyone else followed suit. So, of course, we can point to Persia as the big enemy if we're Alexander, and a lot of the Greeks felt that this was the right thing to do. All right, because if the Persians were left unchecked, what was to stop them from invading Persia yet again? All right, so moving forward, Alexander is able to use his father's tactics as well as his own, which are new. His father increased the size of the spears, the javelins, and his son was using a lot of heavy cavalry, whereas the Persians were still using chariots, more so than anything else. So Persians are tired. The Persians can't entirely deal with these new tactics, and Alexander is able to win a quick, decisive victory. All right. And as he wins Persia, he's also able to put other countries under his control. Egypt, when they realize he's coming, bow to the inevitable and actually welcome him and tell him he's a god. And I really think this was the beginning of the end for Alexander as far as reality check goes, because when you're told you're a god, right? So his men were getting tired, his men were getting dissatisfied, they wanted to go back home. When Alexander had first conquered Persia, he had forced marriages between his soldiers and the Persian women, especially the noble women, in order to create cultural fusion faster. So, and of course, he keeps marching and he keeps marching, and he's got Persia, and now he's conquering Afghanistan, which at the time was called Bactria. He finally gets to India, to the Indian continent. All right. And it's at the river, one of the rivers into India. His men finally rebel and say, no, enough. We're done. We're tired. We want to go home. We've marched across most of the known world. We want to go home. So at that point, his army rebels enough that he has to turn around and go back. But he wants to continue conquering. So he is actually planning to march into the Arabian Peninsula around the time of his death. So he was still planning for the future. Unfortunately, as I'd said earlier, his two young sons, too small to take over. They weren't at a more manly age like Alexander had been. And unfortunately, we're going to see that all of his territory begins to fall apart. All right. But he is a follower of Greek culture, but he also admires a lot of the Persian culture. And in time, the two cultures fuse. And then these two cultures' fusion gets transmitted. It moves over to Greece, or through Greece. It moves into India. It moves into a little bit of Mesopotamia, and it moves into all these different regions. And some of them put new little flavors into it and kind of make it their own. But overall, there will be an incredibly high percentage of population speaking Koine, or common Greek. And we're even going to see the Romans at first felt that Greek culture was more civilized than their own, and they were learning Greek as well as, of course, their native Latin. All right, but of course, Rome is still rising. Right now, it's still where Greek was during its darker age. It's still consolidating. All right. And Alexander encouraged his followers, especially leaders, to embrace the local customs of Persia, and that helped with the fusion. He settled his soldiers on land across Persia. And of course, the Greeks also began to adopt Persian customs at home. All right. And Alexander had married two wives in order to help further alliances. One of his wives was from Bactria, Afghanistan. The other was Persian. All right. In fact, it was the former king's daughter. He had been so confident, he had brought his mother-in-law, I believe it was, and his two daughters to the battle, and then ran away and left them. All right. So, and yes, Macedon did exploit Greek political divisions, as we discussed. All right, so what happens is Alexander dies. It's believed he died from malaria. He had been drinking quite heavily. Watered wine was common in the ancient world because water really wasn't potable unless you mixed it with something. People would use vinegar. They would use wine in order to kill off any germs or bacteria that might be living in the water. And he had been drinking heavily, so chances were the alcoholism combined, with a lowered immune system, he died probably of malaria or possibly some other illness. He was only 33 years old, and yet he had left behind a huge territory. Only Rome at its height really will be comparable. So let's talk about these particular empires that form in the wake, shall we? First off, Greek culture had extended throughout the Greek world, the Persian world, into basically the ancient Near East. All right. And with all of this territory, the generals, upon Alexander's deathbed, they asked him, who gets the kingdom? And he said, to the strongest. Now, the question is, which one's the strongest, right? So there was a lot of, shall we say, jockeying for position. All right. So Ptolemy takes over Egypt, and a lot of his contemporaries thought he was in a way crazy, but he actually took the best part of the pie. Here's why. Egypt is incredibly easy to defend. You've got the cataracts or the waterfalls to help repel invaders. You've got the mountains to help repel invaders. And it was a very stable area. Ptolemy's kingdom lasts the longest, about 400 years. It falls to Rome. You might remember Cleopatra, seventh of her name. She was the ruler at the time that the Romans decided to invade. So Ptolemy lasts for about 400 years. Seleucus takes over the so-called Seleucid kingdom. Ptolemy is now the Ptolemaic kingdom, when we talk about Ptolemaic. Seleucus, it becomes the Seleucid kingdom of Mesopotamia and Persia. They have all the money. But unfortunately for Seleucus, it was a real challenge to keep these groups united. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of anger. Antigonus, or the Antigonid kingdom, will survive, of course, in Greece and Macedon. All right, just to let you know. So quick review here. All right, Ptolemy is a Greek general. He takes over Egypt. He converts it into the longest lasting kingdom. Okay. Then the largest, which also controls most of the Persian Empire, the previous Persian Empire, was, of course, Seleucus, for the Seleucid kingdom. All right. The Antigonid kingdom is what's considered Macedon. All right. Just to give you, a real feel for what's going on here. All right. Unfortunately, all of these kingdoms took advantage of the great bureaucracies that the Persians had left in place, that the Egyptians became heir to, in part thanks to Alexander's, people being left behind to help guide them. And here's the thing. All of them become despotic monarchies. It's all about the people in charge. It's not about the people who are in the kingdom. It's about the people at the top. So they become these despotic monarchies, which of course means that the morale of the people they govern is low. But they do have Hellenistic culture to enjoy, so there are some benefits. All right. Just to give you a picture of what's going on. All right. The exchange of ideas connects the Egyptians, connects the Macedonians, it connects the Mesopotamians, it connects everybody. In fact, some of these things even spread into India, even though Alexander didn't conquer there. There are Hellenistic influences, especially in the art over there. All right, just to help put it in perspective. All right. And of course, Koine Greek, Common Greek, becomes the language of the elite. And anybody who wants to become a member of governments, these bureaucracies, is going to learn Greek because they want to join the elite. All right, again, Antigonid, Greece. They fought desperately bloody battles. Unfortunately, they will be conquered by Rome. All right. The Seleucids, basically, it's too big of a territory. And remember, Persia had all those different languages, different ideas. So the power devolves. All right. And eventually, even back in Macedon, the Antigonids, their territory begins to shrink as well. All right. So, in fact, they help to get Rome involved in playing a part against the Seleucids, and in turn, they themselves become part of Roman control. Remember, when we get to Rome, Rome is huge. All right. Rome was like a shark. It had to keep expanding lest it die. All right, so unfortunately for the Hellenistic kingdoms, without a charismatic, powerful central figure like Alexander to unite everything, and being broken and fragmented, and dealing with a number of internal issues, and being despotic monarchies, these were not going to survive, unfortunately, for them. All right. And there were other smaller, minor Hellenistic kingdoms as well, but we won't discuss them right now for the sake of brevity. All right. And as we look things over, all these Hellenistic kingdoms, remember, they have huge bureaucracies. They're concerned with stability. All right. And they are administrative centers. All right. Think about anything you've had to deal with. Maybe you've had to go down to the motor vehicle commission and get a license. Maybe you've had to get a registration for your car. Maybe you've had to, I don't know, start a business. You had to go see the county clerk. So we're all used to, in some way, dealing with bureaucracy. Maybe you've just dealt with the college bureaucracy. You had to send in certain forms and show certain documents in order to get certain things taken care of. We're all used to bureaucracy. It's a fact of our lives in the 21st century. But during the Hellenistic period, administrative centers, administrative systems really began to come into their own, and this was really the beginning of bureaucracy. So all of the Hellenistic cities, they would be central, and then you'd have your hinterland, people who would be farming, maybe small areas, enclaves of artists that might not be able to work in town. For example, tanners who tanned hides. It was so nasty and so smelly. A lot of cities, especially even in the medieval period, wanted those people outside the city if possible, or if they had to practice in the city, in certain contained areas. So all of these Hellenistic cities become these administrative centers, and the Greeks dominate, or people who can speak Greek, because Greek culture is everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in Egypt, doesn't matter if you're in Macedon, doesn't matter if you are in Mesopotamia. Greek culture and Greek language are driving everything. So we see the beginning of administrative centers in the cities. All right. And because everything is so stable, if you remember when I spoke in our first lecture about how we have these circles of life, if you will, well, during the Hellenistic period, things were a lot more stable. So people were reproducing, they were having children. And as more and more people were either attracted to migrate into Hellenistic territories in order to get a better life, or were having children, grain became an incredibly important resource. You had to have grain in order to feed your people. So grain becomes one of the most important parts of keeping this urban Hellenistic culture going, all right? And a lot of merchants now are making things. Artists are making things for themselves. They're signing it. They're selling their art on the street. They're going to the agora, the marketplace. They're selling vases. They're selling little pieces of art for people's homes. It used to be they needed patrons. Now it's more like, I'm sure a lot of these artists would have loved Etsy in the day if they'd had access to something like that. A lot more people are thinking about running their own businesses, becoming more involved in manufacturing of goods and trading. All right. Also, scholarship. Remember, we spoke of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Well, now more and more people want to be educated in order to become bureaucrats themselves. Granted, not only males can become these bureaucrats, but it's a way they feel to be able to help their families. Merchants also want to be literate in order to help their families. All right. And surprisingly, remember we spoke of how the Greeks originally considered women more like baby makers, but now women begin to become more seen as human. They're still not given all the rights and freedoms of a man, but women in the upper classes were able to have small businesses of their own. They were able to take over should their husband die and run his business. All right. So they were able to have new opportunities. But of course, being in an urban center also means increased headaches as well. You're living close to other people. So some women in the upper classes were able to get ahead. Unfortunately, if you come from away, if you come from outside of the organization you're at, whether it be in Macedon or Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece, if you're a foreigner, you're probably not going to get quite as many opportunities, and you're going to have to pay more taxes or give over some sort of offering to join the collective. All right. But having said that, it's still probably at this point the most progressive system the world has seen since the beginning of civilization. All right. And again, remember, these opportunities for women were only among the upper classes. Poorer women are still being forced to do housework. They're still being forced to rear children. They're still being forced to weave and do other multiple tasks for their families. Again, it is only the elite women, the upper class women. All right. And because of Hellenistic culture, because of its Greek roots, the Greeks are convinced they are culturally superior. All right. A lot of the tastes, even though there are Persian underpinnings, are still very Greek. All right. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. All right. And of course, as we go through, we're going to see that slavery begins to play a larger role in the ancient world, which we're going to look at shortly. All right. If you are a Greek, your life is very good. You can go to the gymnasium. It's a place of culture. It's a place of schooling. There's also the Lyceum, pioneered by Plato. All right. You are also able to go to the marketplace and buy, depending on your income, anything you want. All right. And Alexandria, named for Alexander, obviously, in Egypt, became a major cultural center. And of course, there was the Library of Alexandria, which was supposed to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. If you were a ship captain and you wanted to pull into port in Alexandria, your toll was interesting. They would take a book from you. You would have, hopefully you would have some books or some scrolls with you, because at this point, books aren't in the same form we know them today. And they would copy that, and then they would give it back to you, and that would be your tax. So that's how the library continued. And in fact, unfortunately, we have found now at the bottom of the water, the port, the bay there, we believe now that we have discovered the remains of the library. Unfortunately, to just the building. Hopefully those manuscripts were saved, and we'll find them someday, because there's still a number of ancient works that are missing. All right, and speaking of history, Polybius wrote a history of Roman expansion, because at this point the Romans are starting to cross from the Latian plain out into the full Italian peninsula, and he was very admiring of the Romans, something that the Greeks didn't like. So just giving you that little foretaste for our next couple of chapters. All right. When we think of the Hellenistic world, cosmopolitan is a good word that comes to mind. Think of New York City. You can walk through New York City and you can see so many different foods, so many different cultures, so many different languages that are spoken. It's a good microcosm to think of in relation to the Hellenistic city. All right. Alexandria actually became a center of what we would consider natural science. How do things work? Believe it or not, there's a period of about 75 years, 80 years where we have this dramatic explosion. All right. Aristarchus actually realized that the earth went around the sun, heliocentric, Helios, like the god of the sun. All right. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth to within 200 miles. He knew the earth was round. And of course, we'll see later during the medieval period, some of these things were disputed, fell out of favor, disappeared. Euclid, if you've ever had a geometry class, I'm sure you've probably not liked Euclid. If on the other hand, if you love geometry, you love Euclid. His textbook was taught for thousands of years. All right, we still have access to that today. Archimedes actually came up with realizing how things worked, how things float. Principles of irrigation, which of course would be critical for farmers for hundreds of years. All right, medicine, Hippocrates, your doctor takes a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. All right, understanding the body and how it works, applying reason rather than religion and superstition to how the body works. I mentioned in the discussion board about the miasma. If you've ever seen Pigpen from Peanuts, he's always got that cloud around him. Well, it's much the same way the Greeks believed that if you had a miasma, bad luck, it was this invisible fog that surrounded you and everybody who was near you could be infected by it and then get a miasma of their own. But now they're realizing that medicine doesn't work this way. It's more, it's organic. It's not religious. Illness is caused by physical causes rather than. All right. And we need to discuss philosophy because, again, we saw that beginning of philosophy with reason and logic. Now we see two new philosophies that will drive many, 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 many years of philosophical debate. Epicureanism. What I usually tell my students is think of sex, drugs, and rock and roll minus the rock and roll. Epicureanism is all about here and now. I guess you could call it YOLO, you only live once. There's no afterlife if you're an Epicurean. You gather several close friends to yourself and you explore all that the world has to offer. And it is all about pleasure. It is all about gratifying yourself in the here and the now. This philosophy doesn't hold up into the medieval period. It goes away by then. Instead, another philosophy rises, which will actually partner well with the upcoming explosion of Christianity. Stoicism. When we say someone is stoic, they can bear great pain. They, can suffer in silence, if you will. Stoicism believes in an afterlife. In some ways, it echoes Buddhism. Into every life, some suffering must come. We are all going to suffer. You're going to need to go to the dentist. Your tooth needs to be fixed. You're going to stub your toe. Maybe you're going to have emotional pain. Maybe you're going to go through something, with a family member or with a friend. It doesn't matter what kind of suffering you're going to experience. We are all going to experience suffering. The real question is, what do you do with the suffering? Do you embrace it and try to learn from it and grow from it? Or do you try to avoid it? Now, humans have been dealing with suffering for centuries. Stoicism argues there is an afterlife, that even the lowest slave or the highest born freeman can learn and grow from suffering, that suffering is actually beneficial for us in order to make us better people. All right, this is a big oversimplification. If you're interested in this as a philosophy, Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, wrote some great meditations. That's literally the name of the book, Meditations, which is all about Stoicism. All right. And Stoicism has had its fans for many, many years. It, has survived the medieval period, and some people still, think about it and still read about it today. So Stoicism will be the longest lasting of these philosophies to spring out of the Hellenistic world and the previous Greek world. All right. And of course, it ties into religion as well. All right. Now, of course, if I were to ask you about Greek gods, if you've ever read a Percy Jackson book, you're probably like, oh yeah, super easy. Poseidon, Zeus, right? So what's going to happen, though, is they're going to be increasingly drawn, these Hellenistic people, to the so-called mystery cults. All right, Isis will be, and Mithras will be the longest running of these cults. Let me explain. They're given a personal connection to the god. It's believed there were some, shall we say, narcotics that might have helped to increase this feeling of personal connection. Women especially were drawn to Isis because obviously she's a powerful goddess. Brief history of the story of Isis to help explain why she's so popular. Her husband Ra was slain by his traitorous brother Set. Isis gathered up all the pieces, except for one, the family jewels, we'll call it that, make it nice and easy. All right, she puts all the pieces back together and she brings him, Ra, back to life. All right. Fun fact, all the obelisks that dot the landscape of Egypt, we have one here in this country, it's called the Washington Monument, are actually to commemorate this and also to replace or honor the missing part. All right, so just thought I would share that with you. So just to let you know, Isis's resurrection power makes her a very powerful goddess, and a lot of people turn to her in hope of life after death. And of course, this helps to set up Christianity when it becomes a factor, because now people have already got this idea of wanting resurrection. All right. And she's also all about salvation, if you will. All right. The cult of Mithras. If you celebrate Christmas on December 25th, you are not celebrating the birth of Jesus. You are actually celebrating Mithras, unknown to you, because his birthday fell on December 25th. Whereas if you read through the biblical account, Jesus was born in the spring, because there was a decree that all the world must be taxed and there was a census taken. Sorry. So you can see how these mystery cults, though, lend themselves to Christianity and partner with Stoicism to help usher in Christianity. It also will help to hasten later, even in the Roman Empire, more and more turning away from the pagan gods, because they weren't getting that personal connection with Zeus, or in the Roman parlance, Jupiter, and these mystery cults will continue for a number of years. All right. And the Jews, of course, being a one God society, a monotheistic society, actually have an interesting reaction. Many of them, of course, reject Hellenism and its syncretism, where they argue syncretism is all gods are alike. It doesn't matter if you call them Helios or Apollo, it's still the sun god. All right. So, having said that, going forward, some of the Jews partake of the Hellenistic culture. A lot of them, however, remain aloof and don't want to partake. All right. And of course, Alexander the Great, we still don't know where his body is. I mentioned earlier about his body. Ptolemy is said to have taken the body for legitimacy and power, was seen as a magical object, back to Egypt and buried him. We're still looking for him. There have been a number of expeditions mounted. Nobody's been able to find him. They found a sarcophagus that looked like it might have housed him at one time, but there's still no body. They've been looking. A lot of Macedonian royal family figures have been unearthed. Their DNA has been checked. There's clearly familial ties, but we still have no Alexander. So we don't entirely know what he looked like. And of course, these are based off of descriptions, but we don't have an eyewitness. All right, and of course, as you can see, Alexander covered much, much territory. All right. And this, of course, is a mosaic of the Roman persuasion. Don't forget, too, if I'm flipping through these slides too fast, you have access to the slides in the Documents and Resources section, and you can read them at your leisure. And as you can see, the kingdom has gotten smaller. It's been broken up. All right. And Ashoka, who is part of the Mauryan Empire in Egypt, or in India rather, is actually swayed and influenced by this Hellenistic culture. And he is going to actually infuse that with his own customs. And we're going to see that actually translates into Buddhist art and another number of other, ideas and art going forward, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. All right. However, I think we do need to address something that I did promise, and I think this is a good slide to pause on to do that. if you're an elite living in the ancient world, your life is probably pretty good. But a lot of the labor was done by slaves. Now, if you're familiar with American history, you know certain people groups were brought here against their will in order to further the economics of America. I don't want to get into that history, but I do want to point out how ancient slavery is very different from that in some respects, not all, but some. In the ancient world, anyone could become a slave at any time. Common ways for people to become slaves were you were born into it, status of your mother carried over to you. So obviously, if your mother was a slave woman and somebody forced themselves upon her, the child of that union would then be considered a slave. It could also be you were sold into debt slavery, you owed too much money, so your parents could actually sell their children into debt slavery and then eventually sell themselves in order to pay off debts. Children were expensive, especially girl children. So as the ancient world progressed, a lot of people sold off their daughters before their sons because sons could inherit and daughters needed a dowry, which could be expensive to raise. So you were born into it. You had possibly debt slavery, although that wasn't the most common way to go. All right. And then, of course, you had prisoners of war, people who were taken. All right, though, here we have a Gaulish chieftain and his wife who clearly would rather die and kill himself and his spouse rather than see themselves sold into slavery. Slavery was a terrifying proposition. You didn't know where you were going to be. You didn't know who you were going to be sold to. You didn't know what you were going to be doing. So the least significant form of slavery acquisition was debt slavery. All right. And a lot of the Greek city-states had been trying to keep that from happening with the reforms of Solon, for instance. All right. If you were sold into slavery, you did not want to be in the mines. The mines were a horrible place to be because you would die slowly of white lung or black lung from breathing in everything. You would be treated harshly. You would work long hours. So you did not want to go to the mines. The galleys were almost as bad. All right. And with that in mind, we see the beginning of a slave society. Rome at its height will be a society built on the backs of slaves. But the Hellenistic world, with Alexander's conquests, with those of the despotic monarchs that followed, a lot of people found themselves in very dangerous places and possibly in the path of an invading army. So slavery was becoming more and more common. We don't have exact numbers. We're dealing with sources that are questionable, but these were some of the things to consider. And a lot of people, as I said, would rather die than go into slavery. If you were born into it and that's all you knew, you might not like it, of course, because who would want to be a slave, but you would at least not fear it as much, perhaps. But having said that, slaves had very different experiences in the ancient world. If you worked for a noble household, you could actually, in some cases, earn tips and other things and work your way out. Not everyone was so fortunate, especially in the Roman world. They actually had a system called peculium where people could actually work and put aside their own money to work their way out. So these are just some of the things I want to raise. The ancient world had a very different view of slavery than more modern times. Unfortunately, though, they believed the longer you were in slavery, the less of a human you were. Aristotle's theory of natural slavery would be a horrible, horrible justification for many centuries for people. It was even used during the 1800s, and it's a reprehensible theory. All right, and of course, as I said, if you were living in an upper class, things were going well. As you can see, there's some beautiful jewelry, you had access to riches. All right. And of course, the different the Greek tragedies and comedies produced sculpture. This is the golden age of Greek sculpture, where you see realism, idealism. Of course, being that this is a Roman copy, it's going to be more focused on showing every blemish and every warp. But notice Hellenistic sculptures are changing. They're becoming more and more realistic. And of course, this hyper-realism will really be evident in Roman sculpture. But here's where it starts. All right, and as I mentioned earlier about the Jewish people, a lot of them rebelled against Hellenism. They wanted to remain pure culturally, religiously, and unfortunately, they will have to form a revolt against the Seleucids because they're going to find their way of life threatened. There are actually 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees as books in the Apocrypha, which is Bible books that were not canonized, were not accepted fully into the canon for the final decisions. And some of them are historical documents that relay some of these struggles. All right, and as you can see our timeline, and you can see Rome in the yellow. All right, Rome has been busy. They've been spreading across the Latian plain. They've begun to take on more and more territory. They're conquering the peninsula. And of course, in time, they will become a powerhouse, which we will be discussing later. All right, so I've given you a lot to think about. And of course, please, reach out to me with any questions or concerns you have. I hope this has helped explain some of it. I know I've just given you a very brief overview, but I know too that you're reading the book. I don't need to go over every word, but I do want to give you some perspective and an overview to help you out. All right, so on that note, Chapter 4, let me know if you have any questions, and you can always find me at my email, and we can always set up a Zoom or a Google Meet if you need it. All right? So on that note, I hope you have a wonderful week and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in Chapter 5. Take care. Bye.